Mila's mornings were a whirlwind of tasks: burnt toast, mismatched socks, and a relentless battle to convince Jasper that brushing his hair was, in fact, necessary. Their tiny apartment in Seattle was a far cry from the life she once imagined for herself, but it was theirs. She had learned to stretch every dollar, but lately, the stretching wasn't enough. Freelance photography paid in trickles, and when the landlord's latest rent reminder had landed on her kitchen counter like a ticking bomb, she knew something had to give. She had just finished an exhausting gig, a grumpy real estate agent who demanded she make every property look twice its actual size, when she met Isadora Hawthorne. The woman appeared out of place in the neighborhood coffee shop where Mila was downing an overpriced latte she could barely justify. Isadora carried herself with an elegance that made people step aside without realizing they were doing it. Her tailored coat was the color of dark wine, her sleek bob pristine, her eyes assessing. Mila had been wiping coffee off her camera lens when the woman slid into the seat across from her, uninvited. "You look like someone who needs an opportunity," Isadora said smoothly, folding her hands in a way that suggested she was used to people listening. Mila blinked. "If this is an MLM pitch, I'm going to stop you right now." A smile tugged at the corner of Isadora's mouth, the kind that suggested she wasn't used to being interrupted. "Not quite. I know who you are, Mila. I've seen your work. You're talented. And you're struggling." Mila bristled. She didn't like people stating the obvious, especially not people who smelled like expensive perfume and walked into rooms like they owned them. "If this is about photography, I'm listening. If not, I want to hire you for something else," Isadora interjected. "A role, if you will." Mila leaned back, wary. "What kind of role?" For the briefest moment, something flickered in Isadora's gaze. Amusement? Calculation? She reached into her purse and pulled out a crisp photograph, placing it between them. Mila hesitated before looking down. It was like staring into a distorted mirror. The woman in the picture had the same high cheekbones, the same dark brown eyes, even the same stubborn curve of her mouth. There were differences, of course. Celeste Prescott's hair was lighter, her features a touch more delicate, but the resemblance was undeniable. Mila's pulse kicked up. "Who is she?" "Celeste Prescott." Isadora's tone softened, but only slightly. "She disappeared 10 years ago. Officially, she ran away. Unofficially, I believe she was silenced." Mila frowned, looking back at the photograph. The name felt familiar, a whisper from old headlines. "Silenced? You think she was murdered?" "I think she was erased," Isadora said carefully. "And I think her stepfather, Victor Prescott, knows exactly what happened to her." The Prescott name she knew. The family was old money, philanthropists, investors, the kind of people whose names appeared in gold lettering on museum walls. Victor Prescott had inherited his wealth through marriage and, when his wife passed, took over the empire. If Isadora was right, he had taken over a lot more than that. Mila's head spun. "I still don't understand what this has to do with me." Isadora exhaled as if explaining it should have been unnecessary. "You bear a striking resemblance to Celeste. That's why I sought you out. I want you to impersonate her. Just for one night." Mila let out a sharp laugh. "That's insane. I'll pay you $20,000. The laugh died in her throat. Her first instinct was to say no. It was reckless, absurd, dangerous, even. But $20,000? That was stability. That was getting ahead instead of just treading water. That was finally fixing the brakes on her car without worrying about next month's grocery bill. She swallowed. "Why now? Why is this suddenly so important?" Isadora's eyes darkened. "Because after all these years, Victor Prescott is starting to act like a man with something to hide. I need to know why." Mila shook her head, still gripping the coffee cup like it was the only thing keeping her grounded. And you think if he sees me, he'll confess? Not immediately. But his reaction will tell me more than you realize. Isadora tilted her head. You don't need to do much. Show up at the Prescott Foundation Gala, be seen, and leave the rest to me. Mila stared at the photograph again. She had always been practical, never one to entertain wild ideas. But practicality had gotten her exactly nowhere. She thought of Jasper, of how he deserved more than scraped knees and secondhand everything. She thought of the exhaustion that sat heavy in her bones, of how tired she was of choosing between bills. This is insane, she muttered. Perhaps, Isadora said. But it's also lucrative. Mila's grip tightened on the cup. She knew better than to take risks like this. She also knew what desperation felt like. And right now, it felt a lot like saying yes. She exhaled. What exactly do I have to do? The smell of hairspray was suffocating. Mila sat in front of an oversized vanity, blinking at the stranger in the mirror. A team of professionals hovered around her, adjusting strands of hair, dabbing concealer beneath her eyes, murmuring instructions she barely processed. The stylist with the sharp bob and sharper cheekbones stepped back, tilting her head in satisfaction. She's perfect, the woman declared, arms crossed like an artist admiring her masterpiece. Mila wasn't so sure. Her dark brown hair had been lightened to a honeyed chestnut, styled into the same effortless waves Celeste Prescott had once worn. The subtle arch of her brows had been reshaped, her high cheekbones dusted with just enough contour to sharpen the resemblance. Colored contacts masked the warm brown of her eyes with a softer hazel. Even her lips had been adjusted, painted in the exact shade Celeste had favored. Say something, Isadora's voice broke through the haze. She had been observing the transformation from the doorway, arms crossed, watching like a director waiting for her lead actress to step into character. Mila swallowed. I look different. Good, Isadora said. That's the point. The gown arrived next, an emerald green slip of silk that hugged her frame and shimmered under the vanity lights. Isadora handed her a pair of earrings, delicate diamonds set in platinum. Celeste's. Mila hesitated before fastening them. You really think this is going to work? Victor hasn't seen her in a decade. The mind plays tricks when it wants to. Isadora's expression was unreadable. Tonight, you are Celeste Prescott. The car pulled up to the Prescott estate an hour later. Mila stepped out, heels clicking against the marble driveway, eyes lifting toward the grand estate bathed in golden light. Luxury cars lined the circular entrance, and beyond them, a sea of Seattle's elite floated through the gala, dressed in designer gowns and tuxedos, champagne glasses balanced in elegant hands. She inhaled slowly. The magnitude of what she was about to do pressed against her chest, heavy and unrelenting. It wasn't just the wealth surrounding her, it was the weight of stepping into someone else's life, of pretending to belong to a world that had once belonged to someone who had vanished. A server drifted past with a tray of flutes. Mila resisted the urge to grab one for courage. Then she felt it, eyes on her. She turned her head slightly, and there he was. Oliver Sterling stood frozen near the entrance to the ballroom, his glass halfway to his lips. His gaze locked onto hers, his expression shifting from polite detachment to something raw and disbelieving. He looked like he'd seen a ghost. Her stomach twisted. The man in front of her wasn't just any guest. He was Celeste's former fiancé. He took a step forward, then another, his features contorting between shock, relief, and something darker. Mila's pulse pounded as he closed the distance, his breath uneven. Celeste, he murmured, his voice thick with something she couldn't name. Panic gripped her. She had expected surprise, suspicion, maybe even curiosity. But this was grief. He wasn't just seeing someone who resembled Celeste. He was seeing Celeste. Mila forced herself to smile, soft and uncertain, a woman caught between familiarity and hesitation. Oliver, she said, because anything else would be worse. His name coming from her lips seemed to shake him. His hand trembled as he reached toward her, as if touching her might shatter the illusion. "Where have you been all these years?" His whisper barely carried over the hum of conversation around them. Mila opened her mouth, but nothing came. A shadow passed between them. Victor Prescott. He was watching. The way he stood, hands clasped lightly in front of him, was deliberate, controlled. But his eyes, they lingered too long. A quiet assessment, a measured calculation. And then a smile. Smooth, practiced, almost warm. But there was something in it that made Mila's skin prickle. "Mila," Oliver said again, his fingers grazing her wrist. Victor finally spoke. "You must excuse us," he said, his voice silk over steel. "But I believe my stepdaughter has just returned home." Mila's smile was starting to hurt. She had spent the last hour pretending to be Celeste Prescott, nodding through reintroductions with strangers who claimed to have known her for years, each encounter more surreal than the last. But nothing had shaken her more than Victor's invitation. "You must stay at the estate," he had said smoothly, swirling his drink as if this were the most natural suggestion in the world. "It is, after all, your home." Mila's pulse had skittered at the offer, but she had forced a polite expression, feigning hesitation. Victor didn't push. He simply waited, watching her with that patient, calculating gaze, as if he already knew what her answer would be. She excused herself as quickly as she could, slipping onto the terrace, desperate for air. The gala was beautiful, overwhelming, suffocating. Chandeliers dripped from vaulted ceilings, casting everything in warm, golden light. Waiters moved like ghosts through the crowd, balancing flutes of champagne and delicate amuse-bouches no one really ate. Conversations buzzed around her, laughter bubbling in the distance, but she felt completely alone. A hand closed around her wrist. She turned sharply, breath catching, but it was Oliver. Of course it was Oliver. He stared at her like he was trying to solve a puzzle, fingers gripping her arm just tight enough to make her nervous. "You haven't answered me," he said, voice low, rough. "Where have you been all these years?" Mila swallowed. "Oliver, Don't," he cut in, shaking his head. "Don't say you don't remember. That's ridiculous." She forced herself to hold his gaze. "It's not ridiculous," she said, because this was the only way she knew how to play it. "I don't, everything is fragmented. I don't know what happened." His jaw tightened. He exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair, and for the first time, she saw something besides disbelief in his face. Pain. "Do you have any idea what it was like?" His voice wavered, the words barely more than a whisper. "Looking for you? Wondering if you were alive, if you were dead?" Mila had no idea what to say to that. The door to the terrace swung open, and Victor's voice sliced through the thick tension. "I assume I'm not interrupting anything," he said. Oliver dropped her wrist instantly. He took a step back, his entire body stiff, but Victor wasn't looking at him. His eyes were on Mila. "Have you thought about my invitation?" he asked, the corners of his mouth tilting in what might have passed for warmth. Mila hesitated. She had planned on leaving, returning to the hotel where she could breathe, where she could call Isadora and tell her this was spiraling out of control. But Victor was expecting that, wasn't he? If she ran, she would confirm every doubt simmering beneath his polished exterior. Her voice faltered. Isadora had warned her. Distance would only make Victor more suspicious. The only way to keep him off balance was to act as though she belonged. She inhaled. "Yes," she said, smoothing her dress with steady hands. "I'll come home." Victor smiled. A real one, this time. But the unease that curled in Mila's stomach told her she had just made a terrible mistake. The ride to the Prescott estate was silent. Victor had left the gala early, sending his car to bring her later, as if he already knew she would say yes. She sat in the back seat of the sleek black vehicle, staring at her reflection in the window, at the woman she had become in the span of a few short hours. The estate loomed in the distance, a sprawling masterpiece of stone and glass, set against acres of perfectly manicured land. It was too grand, too untouched, the kind of place that had never known real warmth. A butler greeted her at the door, his face impassive as he led her inside. Mila forced herself to walk like she had done this 100 times before, like she belonged in the high-ceilinged entryway with its marble floors and ridiculous floral arrangements. "Your room has been prepared," the butler said. "Mr. Prescott will see you in the morning." She didn't argue. Didn't breathe until she was alone in the vast bedroom, its king-sized bed covered in pillows that looked untouched. She sat at the vanity, staring at the reflection that had fooled an entire room. It was one thing to play a part for a few hours. It was another to sleep under Victor's roof, to pretend to be his stepdaughter while trying to figure out what had really happened to her. A soft sound startled her. A whisper of paper against the floor. She turned, heart hammering, and spotted it. A small folded note, slipped beneath the door. With shaky fingers, she picked it up, unfolding the paper. "You are not her. Leave before it's too late." The room suddenly felt colder. The walls closer. Someone new. The Prescott estate was beautiful in the way a museum was beautiful, grand, pristine, and filled with the kind of silence that didn't feel empty but watchful. Mila stood at the entrance, taking in the massive crystal chandelier hanging above the marble foyer, the towering staircase that curved upward like something out of a Gothic novel, the endless halls stretching into rooms she would never be able to map in her head. The air smelled like polished wood and something faintly floral, a scent too delicate to place, like it had been lingering there for decades. The staff barely acknowledged her as they moved through the house with mechanical efficiency, gliding between rooms, adjusting things that didn't seem out of place. It was the kind of household where everything ran smoothly, where trays of tea appeared before they were requested, where a single wrinkle on a cushion was straightened before anyone had a chance to notice. Mila felt like an intruder in someone else's carefully preserved world. The bedroom they had prepared for her was cavernous, with a four-poster bed draped in fabric so soft it looked like mist. A fireplace sat unlit against the far wall, above it an oil painting of a woman whose expression was unreadable, her features unsettlingly familiar. Celeste's mother. Mila didn't unpack. There was nothing to unpack. The only belongings she had were in a small overnight bag, which looked ridiculous sitting on the edge of the oversized dresser. She perched on the edge of the bed, gripping her hands together, exhaling slowly. She had made it inside, into Victor's home, into Celeste's life. But now what? A knock at the door made her jump. Before she could answer, it swung open. Oliver. He stepped inside without hesitation, his gaze sweeping over her, then the room, like he was checking for something out of place. He didn't speak right away. He just stared. Mila shifted under his scrutiny. He pulled something from his pocket and held it up. A delicate gold bracelet, the kind that had to be custom-made, with tiny, engraved initials woven into the design. "You always wore this," Oliver said, his voice rough, his grip tight around the piece of jewelry. "You never took it off. Do you remember?" Mila's stomach twisted. She didn't know what to say. If she pretended to remember too much, he'd pick up on the inconsistencies. If she admitted to remembering nothing, he'd never believe her. She started again, fumbling. Don't, Oliver cut in. His eyes darkened, something dangerous simmering beneath the surface. "Don't say you don't remember, Celeste." He took a step closer. Mila resisted the urge to shrink back. "I spent years looking for you," he said, voice low, strained. "I tore this city apart trying to find out what happened. And now you're here, and you want me to believe you just forgot?" The intensity in his face, the desperation in his words, made it hard to breathe. He wasn't just suspicious. He was angry. Oliver, What happened to you? He clenched the bracelet in his fist. Where did you go? Who took you from me? Mila swallowed hard. She could feel the weight of everything Celeste had left behind pressing in, suffocating. She needed to keep control, to stay ahead, but Oliver's pain was raw, almost unbearable to look at. I wish I knew, she whispered. But it's all pieces. Nothing fits. Oliver's expression twisted, his fingers loosening around the bracelet. He exhaled sharply, turning away, running a hand through his hair like he was trying to steady himself. Mila let herself breathe. The sound of footsteps echoed in the hallway. Slow. Measured. Victor. He leaned against the doorframe, watching them, his expression unreadable. His presence shifted the energy in the room instantly. Oliver straightened, his jaw tightening, but he didn't move away. Victor's gaze lingered on the bracelet in Oliver's hand before settling on Mila. Everything all right? Mila nodded quickly, trying to seem composed. Yes. We were just catching up, Oliver finished, voice clipped. Victor's smile was almost amused. Almost. How wonderful. Something about the way he said it made Mila's stomach knot. Oliver took a step back, slipping the bracelet into her palm. Hold on to it, he muttered. Maybe it'll help. He brushed past Victor on his way out. Mila watched Victor watch him leave. Then his attention turned back to her, and the smile faded. This house has missed you, he said. I do hope you're here to stay. Mila held the bracelet tighter. She had never felt less welcome. The house was too quiet. Not the kind of quiet that brought peace, but the kind that hummed beneath the surface, waiting to be broken. Mila had spent the entire day moving through the halls, nodding politely to house staff, playing the role of Celeste Prescott with careful precision. But the weight of it was suffocating, and Isadora's latest demand only made it worse. You need to find something, she had said that morning, her voice low and urgent over the burner phone Mila had hidden in her bedside drawer. Anything that proves Victor was involved in Celeste's disappearance. You're inside now. Use it. Mila wanted to argue, to remind Isadora that she wasn't some trained spy, that she had already risked enough. But she didn't, because the truth was, she needed proof just as badly. Victor's presence unnerved her. The way he watched her, patient and unreadable, as if waiting for a misstep. The way he spoke in careful riddles, as if testing how much she truly remembered. She had to stay ahead of him, had to give herself some leverage before he decided to push back. That was how she found herself in Celeste's old bedroom. The room was untouched, eerie in its preservation. Mila stood in the doorway, her pulse ticking higher with every second. The bed was still made, draped in soft blue sheets that looked like they hadn't been disturbed in years. The vanity held a row of expensive perfumes, the bottles dust-free, as if someone had been tending to them all this time. A shrine. Mila stepped inside, forcing herself to breathe. She ran her fingers over the surface of the vanity, feeling the smooth glass beneath her fingertips. The jewelry box was still there, an ornate silver case with delicate engravings. She lifted the lid, half expecting it to be empty. It wasn't. Inside, a pair of pearl earrings sat beside a delicate gold locket. Mila's throat tightened. It was the kind of piece a girl would be given as a child and treasure into adulthood. A keepsake. A piece of history. She closed the lid carefully. There had to be something else. Something that mattered. The desk drawer stuck when she tried to open it. Not from age, but from resistance. Mila pulled harder, wincing as the wood groaned, and then it gave way with a sharp jolt. Papers. Letters. Stacked neatly, waiting. She reached for the first one, her breath catching as she unfolded it. Celeste's handwriting was unmistakable, elegant but rushed, as if written in a hurry. The words bled into one another, frantic, desperate. I don't trust him. He watches me. He knows I want to leave. He won't let me. I need to find a way out before it's too late. Mila's hands shook. She grabbed another letter. The same jagged, slanted script. The same overwhelming fear. If anything happens to me, it's because of him. Her stomach twisted. This was it. Proof, written by Celeste herself. And yet, Mila knew it wasn't enough. Victor had power, control. A few desperate letters wouldn't be enough to break through his defenses. She needed something stronger. Footsteps in the hall made her freeze. She shoved the letters back into the drawer, slamming it shut just as the door creaked open. Oliver. He stepped inside without hesitation, his face shadowed in the dim light. His expression was unreadable, but there was something sharp in his eyes, something that made the room feel smaller. You keep disappearing, he murmured. I don't like it. Mila swallowed, keeping her voice steady. I needed air. Oliver tilted his head slightly. From what? She hesitated. He took another step closer. You used to tell me everything, he said, voice low. Now you're always running. She wasn't sure what scared her more, the fact that he sounded genuinely hurt or the fact that his hurt had an edge to it, something dark, something hungry. Oliver. You don't remember me. His voice was quiet but sharp. But I remember you. She barely had time to react before his hand lifted, his fingers grazing the side of her face. A touch meant to be affectionate, but it sent a shiver down her spine. You're different, he murmured. But you're the same. I know you're in there. I just have to make you remember. Mila's breath caught. She had seen grief before. She had seen longing. But this wasn't just grief. It was something else. Something dangerous. Mila was brushing her hair, trying to shake the unease that had settled in her chest, when her phone vibrated against the vanity table. She grabbed it instinctively, half expecting another message from Isadora, but the number was unfamiliar. A single line glowed on the screen. You're playing a deadly game. Her stomach dropped. The air in the bedroom felt suddenly thicker, as if the walls had inched closer while she wasn't looking. She read the message again, her pulse thudding in her ears. Someone new. She forced herself to exhale slowly. It could have been a scare tactic. A cruel joke. But it didn't feel like one. It felt like a warning. She erased the message. Dinner was being served in the formal dining room, a setting that felt more like a theater stage than a place to eat. The chandelier cast a golden glow over the long mahogany table, polished silver glinting under the candlelight. The staff moved like ghosts, filling glasses, setting down plates, retreating into the background without a word. Victor sat at the head of the table, cutting into his steak with measured precision. Mila was seated to his right, Oliver to her left, his presence a quiet pressure at her side. She had barely touched her food. Victor dabbed the corner of his mouth with his napkin before turning his attention to her. Do you remember the summer we spent in France? Mila swallowed. France? Victor's expression remained pleasant, but she knew better. This was a test. You were 12, he continued, swirling the wine in his glass. You used to sneak into the kitchen late at night. The chef caught you once, stealing pastries from the cooling rack. He chuckled softly, shaking his head. You cried so hard I had to bribe him not to tell your mother. Do you remember what I gave him? Mila's fingers tightened around her fork. The room was too quiet. The air too thick. She knew the wrong answer could ruin everything. But so could an obvious lie. She forced a small smile. I remember the pastries. Victor tilted his head slightly. But not the bribe? She let out a quiet laugh, as if embarrassed by the lapse in memory. So much of that time feels hazy. There. Not a denial. Not an admission. Just enough to give him nothing. Victor didn't react at first. Then he smiled, but his eyes remained cold. Strange. You were always so sharp. A muscle in Oliver's jaw ticked. It's been 10 years, he said, his voice even but firm. Of course things are hazy. Mila turned slightly, surprised. Oliver had barely spoken all evening, had spent most of the meal staring at his untouched drink, but now he was looking directly at Victor, his gaze unwavering. Victor's smile remained, but something beneath it shifted. The tension between them stretched so tight Mila thought it might snap. Victor set down his glass. Of course, he said smoothly. Memories fade. We can always make new ones. Mila felt it then. This wasn't just a test. This was a trap. Victor was watching her, waiting for the moment she slipped. And if she did, she wouldn't be the only one to fall. Mila had barely closed the door behind her when she heard the footsteps. Slow, unsteady, heavy against the polished wood floors. Her pulse spiked. She turned just as Oliver stepped into the doorway. He wasn't supposed to be here. The dim light from the hall cast sharp shadows across his face, his usually crisp features undone, his tie loosened, his shirt rumpled, his eyes dark and glassy. The scent of whiskey clung to him, thick and inescapable. You've been avoiding me, he murmured. His voice was quiet, but there was something in it that made her stomach tighten. I've been tired, Mila said carefully. It's been overwhelming being back. Oliver stepped inside, closing the door behind him with a deliberate slowness that sent a shiver down her spine. I don't believe you, he said simply. She took a step back. Oliver. You don't get to do this, he cut in, his voice raw. You don't get to disappear, to leave me searching, to make me think you were dead, and then come back acting like I'm a stranger. His words knocked the air out of her. He was in pain. That much was clear. But there was something else beneath it, something sharp, something that curled around his grief and turned it into something dangerous. Do you have any idea what it did to me? His voice dropped lower, rougher. To lose you? To never know why? He was in front of her now. Close. Too close. His fingers brushed against her wrist, barely a touch, but enough to send a shockwave through her. Tell me, he whispered. Tell me why you left me. Her throat was dry. She needed to say something, anything that would calm him, that would make him step back. But she couldn't think past the way his eyes burned into hers, past the way the room suddenly felt too small. And then his lips crashed against hers. The force of it sent her stumbling back against the wall, his hands coming up to grip her waist, anchoring her there. It wasn't gentle. It wasn't tender. It was desperate, consuming, filled with something unspoken and twisted. She didn't kiss him back. Her hands pressed against his chest, pushing, but he didn't seem to notice. Or maybe he didn't care. Then, suddenly, as if realizing something, he pulled away just enough to look at her. You feel different, he whispered, almost to himself. His fingers traced her jaw, his touch light now, searching. You taste different. Mila forced herself to stay still, to not tremble beneath his touch. Everything's changed, she said, keeping her voice steady. His eyes flickered, something unreadable passing through them. He let go of her slowly, stepping back as if waking from a dream. He ran a hand through his hair, exhaling sharply, his breath uneven. You're still mine, he murmured. I don't care what's changed. Mila's stomach twisted. Was this what Celeste had been running from? Had she been running from him? Mila gripped the burner phone tightly, pacing the length of her bedroom while Isadora's voice crackled through the line. You have to push him, Isadora said, her tone sharp and decisive. If he had something to do with Celeste's disappearance, he benefited from it. And there's no bigger benefit than controlling the Prescott fortune. Mila exhaled, pausing by the window. The estate grounds stretched out beneath her, pristine and vast, too perfect to be real. Somewhere down there, Victor was moving through his controlled little world, playing the part of a generous, grieving stepfather. If I bring up the inheritance, he'll know I'm testing him, she murmured. Good, Isadora said. That means he'll have to respond. And how he does it will tell us exactly what we need to know. Mila wasn't convinced. Poking the bear was one thing, waltzing into its den with a handful of raw meat was another. But she had come this far. She had put on Celeste's face, stepped into her life, and now there was no turning back. Dinner was the usual affair, Victor seated at the head of the table, a quiet performance of grace and power, while Oliver nursed his drink, barely touching his food. The chandeliers above cast everything in a warm glow, making the silverware glint and the wine look darker than it should. Mila forced herself to eat, to keep her breathing steady. When the conversation lulled, she set her fork down and looked across the table. There's something I've been thinking about, she said. Victor lifted his gaze from his plate, patient. Yes? Mila hesitated just long enough to make it believable. My inheritance. The words settled over the table like dust, the air going suddenly, sharply still. Victor's expression didn't change. Not at first. But there, just for a second, Mila saw it. The pause. The faintest flicker of calculation behind his eyes. And then he smiled. Of course, he said smoothly, dabbing his napkin against his lips. I was wondering when you'd bring that up. Mila kept her posture relaxed, her expression neutral, even as her stomach twisted. You've been gone a long time, Victor continued, his voice gentle, indulgent. I assumed financial matters wouldn't be your first concern upon returning. It was a jab. A subtle one. A reminder that her claim to the Prescott fortune had long since expired in his mind. But she couldn't back down. That money belongs to me, she said. I want it restored. Victor chuckled softly, shaking his head as if she had just asked for a pony. You always were a determined girl. Mila's nails pressed into her palm beneath the table. Victor picked up his wineglass, swirling the liquid absently. We'll discuss the details tomorrow, he said. I'll make sure everything is handled properly. It was too easy. Too smooth. Across the table, Oliver was watching, his grip tightening around his glass. Mila forced herself to nod. Thank you. Victor smiled. But this time, she saw the shadow behind it. She had just set something in motion. And whatever came next wouldn't be easy to control. She didn't sleep that night. Every noise outside her door made her skin prickle, every creak in the floorboard sent her pulse spiking. The estate felt different now. Less like a gilded mansion, more like a trap she had willingly stepped into. She left the light on in the bathroom, just enough to cast a dim glow into the room. Just enough to keep the shadows from feeling too thick. At some point, exhaustion took over. She woke to the sound of dripping water. Her heart pounded as she sat up, eyes darting toward the bathroom. The light was still on, the door slightly ajar. She could see the sink, the marble counter, the mirror above it. The mirror. Her breath caught in her throat. Words were carved into the glass, jagged and deep, the edges reflecting the dim light. Walk away while you still can. Her pulse roared in her ears. Someone had been in her room. And they wanted her gone. The diner smelled like burnt coffee and bacon grease, the kind of place where the waitresses knew the regulars by name and the menus hadn't changed in 20 years. Mila sat in the last booth, facing the door, fingers curled around a ceramic mug she hadn't touched. The neon sign outside flickered against the window, casting a jittery glow over the table. Evelyn arrived 5 minutes late, wearing a faded trench coat and a scarf wrapped so tightly around her neck it looked like armor. She slid into the seat across from Mila without a word, her eyes darting toward the door before settling on her. "You shouldn't have come," Evelyn muttered, pulling a small leather book from her bag and placing it between them. Mila stared at it. The cover was worn, the corners frayed. It looked ordinary. It wasn't. "Celeste's?" Mila asked, keeping her voice low. Evelyn nodded. She wrote in it every night. Kept it hidden in the back of her closet, behind the loose panel in the wall. "I only found it after she disappeared." Mila hesitated before picking it up. The leather was soft from years of handling, the pages slightly warped. She flipped through them, the handwriting slanted and rushed in places, careful and deliberate in others. Evelyn glanced around again, then leaned in. "Victor never saw this. I made sure of it. But I read it, Anne." She exhaled, her hands tightening around the edges of the table. She was scared of him. "I know that much." Mila's fingers froze on the page. "How scared?" Evelyn swallowed. "Enough to run." Mila turned to a random entry. The ink had bled slightly, the words pressed deep into the paper, as if Celeste had been gripping the pen too hard. "He watches me. Always watching. Smiling like it's nothing. Like I don't see what he's doing. I don't know what he's waiting for. But I won't be here when he decides." Mila's breath came out slow and uneven. She flipped through more pages, her heart pounding as she scanned Celeste's words. "Oliver loves me, but sometimes love feels like a cage. Sometimes I don't think he sees me. He sees the version of me he's decided I am. If I leave, will he even recognize me anymore? Or will he just be angry that I was never what he wanted?" Mila's stomach twisted. Victor was the obvious danger. But Oliver had been the person Celeste was supposed to trust. And yet, she had doubted him too. Evelyn's voice was barely above a whisper. "Someone in that house knows you're not her." Mila looked up sharply. "How do you know?" Evelyn hesitated. "Because the way they're acting, it's the same way they acted before Celeste disappeared." Mila's grip on the diary tightened. If Celeste had been planning to run, why had she left this behind? And if someone had known then? They knew now. Mila had rehearsed the conversation in her head 100 different ways, but none of them prepared her for the moment she actually said it. "I'm not Celeste." The words left her mouth before she could soften them, before she could find a way to ease into the confession. They landed between them like a dropped glass, shattering the fragile thing that had been holding Oliver together. For a moment, he didn't move. Then, all at once, the color drained from his face. "What?" Mila's hands curled into fists. "I'm not her," she said again, quieter this time. Oliver's jaw tightened, his chest rising and falling with slow, measured breaths, like he was trying to contain something that wanted to break loose. He took a step forward, then stopped himself, exhaling sharply. "You're lying." "I'm not." "You're lying," he repeated, his voice edged with something dark and trembling. "This is some game, some test." "It's not." The room felt smaller. Oliver took another step, and this time he didn't stop. "No," he murmured, almost to himself. "No, I don't believe you." Mila didn't move. "You need to." His breath hitched, his hands curling into fists. "Why are you saying this?" "Because it's the truth." Oliver let out a sharp, uneven laugh, but there was no humor in it. He was unraveling in front of her, his carefully contained grief splitting open at the seams. "I looked for you," he said. "I never stopped looking for you." His voice cracked, raw and broken. "And now you're telling me that after all these years, I finally found you, except I didn't?" Mila swallowed hard. "Oliver, please. Don't." His eyes burned into hers, bright with something dangerous. "Don't say my name like that." Don't talk to me like you know me. She had never been afraid of Oliver. Uneasy, maybe. Wary. But now, standing in front of him, his whole body trembling with anger, she wasn't so sure. Oliver shook his head, laughing again, softer this time, more chilling. Who are you? Mila opened her mouth, but he was already turning away, running a hand through his hair, his breath coming fast and uneven. I need to think, he muttered, more to himself than to her. I need to. Then, just as suddenly as the rage had come, he was gone. The next morning, Mila barely slept. Every sound in the house made her stomach twist. Every shadow in the hallway made her second-guess what she had done. She knew Oliver would talk to Victor eventually. She just hadn't expected it to be so soon. She spotted them from the top of the staircase, just beyond the sitting room doors. Victor stood with his back to her, his posture rigid. Oliver was facing him, speaking in a hushed, urgent tone. Mila couldn't hear the words, but she saw enough. The way Victor's shoulders tensed. The way Oliver's expression shifted from anger to something else, something sharper, more deliberate. Victor looked worried. Oliver looked calculating. Mila's stomach twisted. Had she just made a terrible mistake? The moment Victor walked into the study, Mila knew. His usual mask of cool detachment was gone, replaced by something raw and seething. The door clicked shut behind him, the sound too final, too deliberate. He didn't sit. He didn't offer his usual polite smirk or measured small talk. He just stood there, staring at her like he had been waiting for this moment. Mila forced herself to stay still. You should have left when you had the chance, Victor said, his voice low, almost calm. But you got greedy. She tilted her head slightly. Greedy? Victor took a slow step forward. You had them all fooled, didn't you? He murmured. Even Oliver, for a while. But I've never been so easily deceived. Mila's heart pounded, but she kept her expression neutral. I don't know what you're talking about. Victor chuckled, shaking his head. It was clever. I'll give you that. The resemblance, the memory lapses, playing just dumb enough to keep everyone guessing. His smile faded. But I'm done playing. Mila's fingers curled against the fabric of her dress, the tiny recorder Isadora had given her pressed against her palm. She had slipped it into her pocket the second she saw Victor's face, pressing the button before he even spoke. Celeste was never supposed to leave this house, Victor said, his voice sharper now, his patience cracking. I made sure of that. A cold, creeping dread coiled in her stomach. Victor took another step toward her. You think you can come in here, claim her inheritance, steal from me? He laughed, but there was no amusement in it. Tell me, what was the plan? Collect the money and vanish again? Or did you really think you could replace her? Mila's throat was dry. She should have been afraid. And she was, but not for the reason Victor probably assumed. Celeste was never supposed to leave. Not Celeste chose to leave. Not Celeste ran. He had kept her here. He had done something. Mila's fingers pressed harder against the recorder. What did you do to her? She asked, her voice quiet but steady. Victor's expression flickered. Just for a second. A crack in the facade. Then, just as quickly, it was gone. He smiled. It doesn't matter, does it? Mila stared at him, at the man who had spent years pretending to be a doting stepfather, a respected businessman. The man who had fooled everyone. Everyone except Celeste. And now, maybe, everyone except her. The detective across the desk looked unimpressed. He had the tired expression of a man who had seen too much paperwork and not enough action, and the way he drummed his fingers against his coffee cup told Mila exactly how this was going to go before he even spoke. This isn't proof, he said, sliding the recorder back toward her. Mila stared at him. Victor admitted she was never supposed to leave. He said it himself. The detective sighed, scratching at his jaw. What he said was vague. Legally, it's nothing. A good defense attorney would argue he meant she was supposed to inherit the estate, or that he was just being dramatic. There's no direct evidence of a crime. Mila felt Isadora stiffen beside her. So what do you need? She demanded. Something real, the detective said. A body. A witness. A direct admission that he harmed her. He leaned back. You have any of those? Mila clenched her jaw. The answer was no. They left the station in silence. Outside, the air was thick with the threat of rain, the sky a dull gray. Mila's hands were still curled into fists as they reached the car. This was our shot, she muttered. It wasn't our only shot, Isadora said, unlocking the door. We need something stronger. Something that forces the police to act. Mila exhaled, her breath shaky. There's only one person who might know what happened. Isadora turned to look at her. Oliver. The Prescott estate loomed in the distance as Mila approached, the weight of everything pressing against her ribs. She had spent so much time fearing Victor, but now she wasn't sure she had been looking at the right threat. She found Oliver in the library, his fingers grazing over the spines of books he probably wasn't reading. He didn't turn when she stepped inside. You were right, he said, voice quiet. About everything. Mila's stomach twisted. Then tell me the truth. Oliver let out a breath, his hand tightening against the bookshelf. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then. She was alive when she left, he murmured. I know that much. Mila's pulse roared in her ears. But? Oliver finally turned to look at her. His face was unreadable. But I never saw her again. The words felt like a door slamming shut. Mila stared at him, waiting for him to say more, to explain, to give her something that wasn't just another dead end. But he didn't. And that was somehow worse than if he had told her she was dead. The knock on the door was sharp, authoritative. It echoed through the Prescott estate, making Mila's stomach twist before she even saw who was on the other side. She didn't have to. She already knew. Victor stood near the grand staircase, arms crossed, wearing the expression of a man who had already won. Two uniformed officers flanked him, their hands resting on their belts, their faces unreadable. There's been a misunderstanding, Victor said smoothly, though the glint in his eyes told a different story. You see, this woman is not Celeste Prescott. One of the officers glanced at Mila. Ma'am, we're going to need you to come with us. Mila forced herself to stay still. On what charges? Fraud, Victor said, his voice casual, almost amused. Impersonation. Attempted theft. You've been living under a false identity, and I'm afraid that's a crime. The officer took a step forward, reaching for his handcuffs. And then, from behind them, another voice. I wouldn't do that if I were you. Isadora. She stepped into the room with the kind of effortless confidence that made people hesitate before they knew why. She was holding something small in her hand, a recorder, her thumb hovering over the play button. Victor's eyes darkened. What is this? Isadora smiled. Insurance. She pressed the button. Victor's own voice filled the room, distorted slightly by the recording but unmistakable. Celeste was never supposed to leave this house. A pause. Crackling silence. I made sure of that. The shift in the officers was immediate. One of them turned to Victor. Sir, we need you to come with us. Victor's mask cracked for the first time. This is absurd. This is an admission of guilt, Isadora corrected. Which makes this less of a fraud case and more of an active investigation into Celeste Prescott's disappearance. Mila didn't breathe. The officers exchanged a glance. One of them stepped forward. "Mr. Prescott, we have more questions for you." Victor's jaw tightened. His gaze flicked to Mila, his lips curling in something between anger and amusement. "This isn't over," he murmured. The officer took his arm. "Actually," Mila said, voice steady, "I think it is." And then, just like that, Victor Prescott was led out of the house in handcuffs. The Prescott estate was quieter now. The kind of quiet that came after a storm, when the damage had been done, and all that was left was the wreckage. Victor was gone. His absence left a hollow space in the house, but it didn't feel like relief. It felt like something unfinished, something still lurking in the walls, waiting to be found. Mila stood in Celeste's old bedroom, looking at the reflection in the vanity mirror. The woman staring back wasn't Celeste. And she wasn't just Mila, either. She was someone in between, someone who had stepped into a world that didn't belong to her and barely made it out. The door opened behind her. She didn't turn. "You're leaving." Oliver's voice was softer than she expected, almost careful. Mila met his gaze in the mirror. "Yes." He stepped closer. "You don't have to." She turned to face him. "I do." Oliver exhaled, raking a hand through his hair. "I know things got complicated." Mila let out a quiet laugh. "That's one way to put it." He didn't laugh. He just studied her, the way he always did, like he was still trying to understand something that refused to be solved. "I loved her," he said. "You know that, don't you?" Mila nodded. "I know." Oliver hesitated, then took another step forward, his voice dropping to something almost pleading. "But she left me." The words hung between them, heavy with the truth he had refused to see for so long. Mila looked at him, really looked at him. The grief, the longing, the need to hold on to something that wasn't there anymore. Oliver had never been the villain in this story. But that didn't mean he wasn't dangerous. She reached out, resting a hand lightly on his arm. "She left because she had to," she said gently. "And so do I." His jaw tensed, but he didn't argue. He just stood there, silent, as she stepped past him, out of Celeste's room, out of the house, out of a life that was never hers to begin with. The town wasn't remarkable. That was what Mila liked about it. The streets were lined with modest brick buildings, the kind of places that had been around forever, an old bakery with a hand-painted sign, a bookstore with a creaky wooden floor, a cafe where people actually knew each other's names. The kind of place where nothing extraordinary ever happened, which was exactly what she needed. Her new apartment was small but had a view of the river. The windows stuck when she tried to open them, and the kitchen faucet dripped if she didn't turn it just right, but it was hers. There was no grand chandelier in the entryway, no marble floors, no staff moving through the house like ghosts. Just her and Jasper, and a space that finally felt like it belonged to them. Jasper adapted quickly. He made friends at school, ones who weren't the children of millionaires or people who spoke in hushed tones about family legacies. He spent afternoons riding his bike through the quiet streets, his laughter echoing through the open windows. At night, Mila tucked him into bed without worrying about what secrets were hiding behind the walls. She found work at a local photography studio. The owner, a woman in her 60s named Margot, had taken one look at Mila's portfolio and hired her on the spot. It wasn't glamorous, mostly weddings, family portraits, and the occasional headshot for a local business, but it was steady. And it was real. One afternoon, Mila stood in the darkroom, watching as an image slowly emerged on the paper. A family, standing in a field of wildflowers, their faces blurred by laughter. She no longer had to pretend to be someone else to survive. And for the first time in a long time, she wasn't looking over her shoulder. The postcard arrived on a Thursday, wedged between a stack of bills and an aggressively cheerful grocery store flyer advertising a sale on peaches. Mila barely noticed it at first. She had one arm full of takeout containers, her keys balanced precariously between her fingers, and she was already mentally listing everything that had to be done before the night was over. Homework, laundry, emails, maybe, if she was lucky, a few minutes to herself before collapsing into bed. It wasn't until she set everything down on the kitchen table that the postcard caught her eye. It wasn't bright or glossy like the usual junk mail. No pictures of cartoon mascots or pre-approved credit card offers. Just a single, unremarkable image. The ocean. Gray waves rolling toward an empty horizon, the sky above muted and overcast. It wasn't a postcard meant to attract tourists. It wasn't a place she recognized. There was nothing about it that stood out, except for the fact that it had been sent to her. She turned it over. There was no stamp. No return address. No postmark. Just a single line of text written in careful, measured handwriting. You saved me. Thank you. That was it. Mila stared at the words, her breath catching in her throat. She read them again. And again. Her fingers tightened around the edges of the card, the paper slightly rough beneath her skin. You saved me. Her mind raced. It had to be Celeste. Who else could it be? She looked at the postcard again, trying to find something, anything, that might tell her more. She ran her thumb over the ink, checking for smudges. She tilted the card in the light, looking for indentations, as if the sender had pressed the pen too hard. But there was nothing. No initials, no markings, no hint of where it had come from. Her stomach twisted. If Celeste was alive, why now? Why not reach out before? Why not more than just a single, cryptic sentence? She stood abruptly, the chair scraping against the floor. The kitchen suddenly felt too small, the walls pressing in as her pulse pounded in her ears. She paced toward the window, staring outside at the quiet street, half expecting to see someone watching from a distance. But everything was normal. The neighbor across the way was watering her plants. A teenager rode past on his bike, earbuds in, oblivious to the world. Somewhere down the block, a dog barked. Mila looked down at the postcard again. The ocean. Was it a place Celeste had been? A place she was now? A message, a clue? Or was it just a picture, something random and meaningless? A rush of memories hit her all at once. The Prescott estate. The chandelier light flickering against the marble floors. Victor's cold, measured voice. Oliver's grip on her wrist. The letter Celeste had written, her fear bleeding onto the pages. The words carved into her bathroom mirror, warning her to leave. It was over now. Victor was gone. The house was behind her. She had rebuilt something new, something stable for her and Jasper. And yet. Mila exhaled, forcing herself to steady her breathing. The past wasn't done with her. She turned the postcard over again, half hoping more words would appear, half dreading what they might say. You saved me. Thank you. No name. No signature. Just a message from a ghost. Jasper's voice broke through the silence. Mom? She turned, startled. He stood in the doorway, rubbing his eyes, his hair still messy from his nap. He blinked at her, then at the pile of mail on the table. What are you looking at? Mila hesitated for only a second before slipping the postcard into the stack of bills. Nothing, baby, she said, forcing a smile. Just mail. Jasper yawned. Can we eat now? I'm starving. She tousled his hair as he walked past her to the fridge, her heart still pounding. She would figure this out later. For now, she was home. The postcard sat on the kitchen table, half buried under a stack of bills and a grocery list scribbled on the back of an old receipt. Mila had tucked it there the night it arrived, telling herself she would deal with it later. That had been 3 days ago. Now, it felt like the only thing she could see. The words haunted her. You saved me. Thank you. Simple. Direct. And completely impossible to ignore. She told herself it could be nothing. A mistake. A message meant for someone else. But that wasn't true, and she knew it. It was Celeste. It had to be. Mila picked up the postcard again, running her fingers over the image of the ocean. The longer she looked at it, the more it felt deliberate. Chosen. Not some random stock photo, but a place with meaning. A place Celeste wanted her to see. Her stomach twisted. Celeste had been alive when she left. Oliver had admitted that much. But what had happened after? Had she gone into hiding? Had she been running all these years? And if so, why now? Why send a message after all this time? Mila turned the postcard over again, scanning the back, looking for something she might have missed. There was no return address. No postmark. No smudge of ink where a signature could have been. It didn't make sense. If Celeste was out there, alive and free, why not say more? Why not come forward? What was she waiting for? Mila exhaled, pressing the heels of her hands against her eyes. She had spent months pretending to be Celeste, slipping into her life, chasing the truth. And now that it was right in front of her, she didn't know what to do with it. A noise from the living room made her look up. Jasper was sitting cross-legged on the floor, flipping through a book. He was humming under his breath, lost in his own little world, completely unaware that his mother's mind was unraveling in the next room. The match flared to life with a sharp hiss, the tiny flame flickering unsteadily between Mila's fingers. She watched it dance for a moment before bringing it to the edge of the postcard. The paper curled instantly, darkening, the flames licking hungrily at the photograph of the ocean. The gray waves twisted and blackened, eaten away by the heat, until the horizon disappeared entirely. Mila stood over the kitchen sink, the metal basin empty except for the burning postcard. She had thought it would take longer. That she would feel something profound. That maybe she'd change her mind. But as the flames consumed the last of the paper, she felt nothing. No relief. No regret. Just certainty. Some mysteries were better left unsolved. She grabbed a glass of water and poured it over the ashes, watching as they hissed and crumbled into nothing. Then she wiped her hands on a dish towel and turned off the kitchen light. From the living room, Jasper's voice drifted toward her, sleepy and content. "Mom?" She glanced over, watching as he stretched out on the couch, his book slipping from his hands. "Yeah, baby?" Jasper yawned. "Are we still going to the farmer's market tomorrow?" Mila leaned against the doorway, taking in the sight of him, safe, happy, untouched by all the ghosts she had left behind. She smiled. "Yeah," she said. "We are." And with that, she left the ashes where they belonged.